Anatomy of the esophagus and stomach. When we talk about the anatomy of the esophagus, we have five main objectives. Those are: the first one is to describe the gross anatomy of the esophagus. Second one is to describe the lymph drainage and nerve supply. Third one is to describe the microscopic anatomy of esophagus. Fourth one is to list the functions of the esophagus, and then to explain the basis of structure-function relationship. When we look into the gross anatomy of the esophagus, it is a muscular tube of about 10 inches long and 2 centimeters wide. So, it is a tube extending from the pharynx to the stomach, and it begins at the level of the lower border of the cricoid cartilage around here, and it ends at the cardiac orifice of the stomach around here. So, at the beginning, it lies opposite to the body of the sixth cervical vertebra. After the beginning, it passes through the diaphragm at the level, it passes through the mediastinum in the thorax, and then it passes through the diaphragm at the level of the 10th thoracic vertebra. Then it joins the cardiac orifice of the stomach. So, it commences in the midline, but when it descends through the neck, it slightly inclines to the left side. So, in the thorax, it passes downwards and to the left side. First through the superior mediastinum and then through the posterior mediastinum. So, at the level of the sternal angle, the aortic arch push the esophagus over to the midline again. In the abdomen, only about 0.5 inches of the esophagus descends before it joins with the cardia of the stomach. When we talk about the relations of the esophagus, its relations are differ in the neck, in the thorax, and in the abdomen. When we talk about its relations in the neck area, it has anteriorly the trachea, the recurrent laryngeal nerves, which are ascending on the each side in the groove between the trachea and the midline, trachea and the esophagus. Posteriorly, it has the prevertebral layer of the deep fascia and the longus colli muscle and the vertebral column. Laterally, it has the lateral lobes of the thyroid gland. Then it has the carotid sheath with its contents. What are the contents of the carotid sheath? Those are common carotid artery, internal jugular vein, and the vagus nerve. So, the relations in the thorax, we can describe them from above downwards. Anteriorly, the esophagus has the trachea, the left recurrent laryngeal nerve, left main bronchus, and the pericardium. So, the left main bronchus has a small constriction on the esophagus. And the pericardium is the one which separates the esophagus from the left atrium. Posteriorly, the esophagus relates to the bodies of thoracic vertebrae and the thoracic duct, oesophagus vein, right posterior intercostal arteries, and the descending thoracic aorta. On the right side, it has the mediastinal pleura, the terminal part of the oesophagus vein. In the left side, it has the left subclavian artery, aortic arch, thoracic duct, the mediastinal pleura. So, inferiorly to the level of the roots of the lungs, the vagus nerve leave the pulmonary plexus and join with the sympathetic nerves, and then with sympathetic nerves it form the esophageal plexus to supply the esophagus. When we consider about the vagus nerves, there is a different on relationship with the esophagus when it comes to anterior vagus, right vagus and the left vagus. So the left vagus nerve lies anterior to the esophagus while the right vagus lies posterior. But at the opening of the in the diaphragm, esophagus is accompanied by the both vagus nerves and branches of left gastric blood vessels and lymphatic vessels. And the fibers from right crust of the diaphragm pass around the esophagus at the opening in the diaphragm in the form of a sling, and it has another constriction at that point. So in the abdomen, it has left lobe of the liver anteriorly and left crust of the diaphragm posteriorly. So there are four main constrictions in the esophagus. First one is at the level of C6 vertebra. It is caused by the cricopharyngeal part of inferior constrictor muscle. Second one is at the level of T4 vertebrae. It is caused by the arch of the aorta. Third one is at the level of T6 vertebrae, and it is caused by the left left main bronchus. Fourth one is at the level of T10 vertebrae. It is caused by the crossing at the diaphragmatic opening by the right crus of diaphragm. Apart from that, there is another indentation caused by the left atrium, but that is more obvious if there is dilatation of the left atrium caused by any other left atrial pathology. So when we talk about the blood supply of the esophagus, its arterial supply can be divided according to upper, middle and lower parts. So the upper 1/3 is supplied by the inferior thyroid artery. And the middle 1/3 comes by the branches from descending thoracic aorta. Lower 1/3 comes from the branches from left gastric artery. Venous drainage also differ from upper, middle and lower parts. So, blood from the upper 1/3 drain into the inferior thyroid veins. From middle 1/3 drain into oesophagus veins, and the lower 1/3 drain into the left gastric veins, and then via the left gastric vein into the portal vein. Then let's talk about the lymph drainage of the esophagus. The upper one third of the esophagus, lymphatics drain into the deep cervical nodes and the paratracheal nodes. So middle one third drain into the superior and posterior mediastinal nodes. Lower one third drain into the lymph nodes along the left gastric vessels and celiac vessels. Nerve supply to the esophagus comes from both parasympathetic and sympathetic systems. So in the neck, these nerves are derived from the recurrent laryngeal nerves and from the sympathetic trunks. In the thorax, the esophagus is supplied by the parasympathetic and sympathetic efferent and afferent fibers. Those comes from the vagus and the sympathetic trunks. In the lower part of the thorax, the esophagus is surrounded by the esophageal nerve plexus. When we talk about the microscopy of the esophagus, the esophagus, when we see a cut section of a esophagus, it has main 4 layers. From outer side to inwards, we can see adventitia in the outermost layer. Then there is muscular layer and there is submucosa, mucosa, and then the epithelium. So this mucosa is a deeply folded layer. Its lumen is lined by thick protective stratified squamous epithelium. So the mucosa can again divided into lamina propria and muscularis mucosa. So this lamina propria is a narrow layer and the muscularis mucosa is a thin smooth muscle layer and it contains scattered lymphoid aggregates. The submucosa is a layer with loose collagenous supporting tissue and it has many elastic fibers. Also, the submucosa contains seromucous glands, larger blood vessels, nerves, and lymphatics. Then comes the muscularis propria. This layer is the one where the muscle layers of the esophagus can be seen. So, this is a thick muscle wall. It has 2 muscle layers, inner circular and outer longitudinal muscle layers. Both are comprised of smooth muscle layers. And the adventitia or the serosa is the outer layer of loose supporting tissue. This layer is the one which conduct major blood vessels, nerves and adipose tissue. So, when we talk about the functions of the esophagus, it is the major organ which helps us to swallowing or deglutition. Swallowing is the process of moving food from mouth to the stomach. So, the food bolus moves from the mouth through the esophagus into the stomach. But esophagus does not involve with digestion or absorption. But it has glands which produce mucus to moist food boluses. And it has sphincters which prevent backflow of foods into the oral cavity. And it has sphincters in upper and lower ends which prevent backflow of foods into the esophagus once they are pushed into the stomach. So when we talk about the basis of structure function relationship, so it is a muscular tube and it has two muscle layers in the muscularis propria with inner circular and outer longitudinal layer. And those muscles are smooth muscles. And this muscle layer can propel food to stomach. And footballers enters stomach through the esophageal hiatus. And because it has no bones to restrict the space inside the esophagus, it can accommodate even a slightly large footballers. And it has some skeletal muscles in upper one-third for swallowing in the pharynx area and smooth muscle in the lower third for peristalsis. So, the swallowed footballers is transported into the stomach through the esophagus via the action of peristalsis. And by the production of mucus by esophageal glands, it lubricate the footballers and by that facilitate the passing of footballers through the esophagus. And as I mentioned earlier, it has two sphincters in its upper and lower ends. So, it has an upper esophageal sphincter to prevent backflow of foods into the mouth. And it has a cardiac sphincter to prevent backflow of foods into the esophagus once the food is in the stomach. Now, let's move on to the anatomy of the stomach. So, our objectives in this part will be to describe the gross anatomy of stomach, to describe the lymph drainage and nerve supply, to describe the microscopic anatomy of stomach, list the functions of stomach, explain the basis of structure function relationship. When we discuss about the gross anatomy, it is the dilated portion of the alimentary canal. So it is a dilated saccular and a bean-shaped portion situated in the upper part of the abdomen, upper left part of the abdomen, and it extends from beneath the left costal margin region into the epigastric and umbilical region. So, it is situated in between the esophagus and the duodenum. And much of the stomach lies under the cover of lower ribs. And it has roughly J shape. But this shape can be vary according to the height of the individual. And it has two openings, the cardiac opening at the esophageal end and the pyloric orifice at the duodenal end, and two curvatures, the greater curvature and the lesser curvature, and two surfaces, anterior and the posterior surface. So, the stomach is relatively fixed at the both ends at the esophagus and duodenum, but very mobile in between. So, in this picture, we can see the parts of the stomach. It is the cardia at the beginning and then it curves upward, and that area is the fundus. You can see it in the yellow color in this picture. Then it comes the body. It is the body comprised of the largest part of the stomach. Then the end part, it is the pylorus. So the fundus is a dome-shaped small area which project upward and to the left of the cardiac orifice. So this area usually is full of gas because due to the gravity, the food you ingest is usually comes toward the lower part of the body of the stomach. So the fundus is usually full of gas. And then the body. The body of the stomach extends from the level of the cardiac orifice to the level of the incisura angularis, a constant notch in the lower part of the lesser curvature here. Then from that part up to the duodenum, you have the pylorus of the stomach. Then you have the, here in this picture you can clearly see the incisura angularis here. Then the pyloric antrum, this part. It is the part which extends from the incisura angularis to the pylorus. So the pylorus is the most tubular part of the stomach. It has a thick muscular wall which called the pyloric sphincter. It is the sphincter which lies in between stomach and the duodenum, and it is the one which control release of food from stomach to the duodenum, and also it is the one which prevent food reflux from uh, duodenum to the stomach again, or the backflow of the food from duodenum to the stomach. So um, as I mentioned, the pylorus is a tubular part. So the cavity of the pylorus is the pyloric canal. And here you have your curvatures. The smaller one is the lesser curvature. The greater one is the large one is the greater curvature. So the lesser curvature forms the right border of the stomach, and it extends from the cardiac orifice to the pylorus. And this lesser curvature suspended from the liver by the lesser omentum. The large curvature of the stomach is the greater curvature. It is much longer than the lesser curvature and extend from the left of the cardiac orifice over the dome of the fundus along the left border of the stomach to the pylorus. Then you have the cardiac orifice. So this is the place where the esophagus connects with the stomach and enters. So here you can't demonstrate a anatomic sphincter, but here you can explain a physiologic mechanism that prevent regurgitation of stomach contents into the stomach. So in the pylorus, this pyloric orifice formed by the pyloric canal. So it is about 1 inch long and it has a thick muscular coat which form a anatomic and a physiologic pyloric sphincter. So there is a plane which goes across this pylorus. It is called as the transpyloric plane. So uh, its position can be recognized by a slight constriction on the surface of the stomach. And there is two omentums on the stomach, which is the gastrosplenic omentum and greater omentum. So gastrosplenic omentum or the ligament is the one which extends from the upper part of the greater curvature to the spleen. And the greater omentum is the one which extends from the lower part of the greater curvature to the transverse colon. So, when we talk about the blood supply of the stomach, the blood supply of the stomach comes from mainly celiac trunk. All of the arteries are derived from the branches of the celiac artery. So, those are the main arteries are left gastric artery, this one, and the right gastric artery, short gastric arteries, left gastroepiploic artery, and right gastroepiploic artery. So, the left gastric artery arises from the celiac artery itself and it passes upward and to the left to reach the esophagus and it supplies to the lowest part of the esophagus and then descends along the lesser curvature of the stomach. By that, it supplies the lower third of the esophagus and the upper right part of the stomach. The right gastric artery arises from the hepatic artery at the upper border of the pylorus and runs to the left along the lesser curvature. It supplies the lower right part of the stomach. So, in this picture, you can see the hepatic artery also arise from the celiac trunk. And the short gastric arteries arise from the splenic artery at the hilum of the spleen and passes forward in the gastrosplenic omentum to supply the fundus. So you can see here the splenic arteries also comes from the celiac trunk. And the left gastroepiploic artery arises from the splenic artery at the hilum of the spleen and passes forward in the gastrosplenic ligament to supply the stomach along the upper part of the greater curvature. Right gastroepiploic artery arises from the gastroduodenal branch of the hepatic artery and it passes to the left and supplies the stomach along the lower part of the greater curvature. The veins of the stomach drains directly into the portal venous circulation, and the left and right gastric veins drain directly. Short gastric veins and left gastroepiploic veins joins the splenic vein. The right gastroepiploic vein joins the superior mesenteric vein. When we talk about the relations of the stomach, it has anterior abdominal wall, left costal margin, left pleura and lung, diaphragm, left lobe of the liver anteriorly. And posteriorly, it has lesser sac, diaphragm, spleen, left suprarenal gland, upper part of the left kidney, splenic artery, pancreas, transverse mesocolon and transverse colon posteriorly. So in this picture, you can see the posterior relationships of the stomach. The lymph drainage of the stomach is shown in this picture. So the lymph vessels follow the arteries into the left and right gastric nodes, the left and right gastroepiploic nodes, and the short gastric nodes. So all lymph from the stomach eventually passes to the celiac nodes, which are located around the root of the celiac artery on the posterior abdominal wall. Nerve supply of the stomach can be divided into sympathetic and parasympathetic. So the sympathetic supply comes from the celiac plexus, and the parasympathetic supply comes from right vagus nerve and the left vagus nerve. Right vagus nerve gives the posterior vagal trunk. So it supplies the posterior surface of the stomach. A large branch from the posterior right vagus nerve passes to the celiac and superior mesenteric plexus and distributed to the intestine also. So the left vagus nerve is the anterior vagal trunk. It supplies the anterior surface of the stomach, and a very large pyloric branch passes down to the pylorus from a large hepatic branch. So these two pictures shows the distribution of anterior vagus in the upper picture and the posterior vagus in the lower picture. So the sympathetic innervation which comes from the celiac plexus carries a proportion of pain transmitting nerve fibers. And the parasympathetic Weber fibers are the ones which are responsible to secretomotor function of the gastric glands and motor function of the muscular wall of the stomach. And the pyloric sphincter receives motor fibers from sympathetic system and inhibitory fibers from the vagus. Now, let's go to the microscopy of the stomach. In the non-distended state, the stomach mucosa has longitudinal folds called rugae. So, these rugae are very prominent in non-distended state, but when we ingest food, they allow distension of the stomach by unfolding. And this rugae helps to reduce the size of the stomach when it is empty. These are the pictures of esophagogastric junction. So here the mucosa has a abrupt transition from protective stratified squamous epithelium of the esophagus to a tightly packed glandular secretory mucosa of the stomach. And this is the general organization of the gastric wall. So, as usual, it also has a mucosal layer, submucosa, muscularis propria, subserosa, and serosa. So, in the mucosa, there are three layers: the epithelium, lamina propria, and the muscularis mucosa. But the difference with the esophagus is that in the stomach there are three layers in the muscularis propria. That apart from the inner circular and outer longitudinal layer, there is a innermost oblique muscle layer in stomach. So, in the body of the stomach, the mucosa has prominent folds or rugae. So the gastric glands that extend from the level of the muscularis mucosa opens into the stomach lumen via the gastric pits or foveolae. In the muscularis propria, there is inner circular, outer longitudinal and innermost oblique muscle layer. In the submucosa, it is as always a relatively loose, distendible layer, connective tissue layer, which contain larger blood vessels. In serosa, it is a peritoneal, it is a connective tissue layer which covers the peritoneal surface and it is thin. So, in the lesser and greater omentum, there is adipose tissue and those lesser and greater omentum is attached along the lesser and greater curvature of the stomach. And there are lymph nodes and large blood vessels within this omental fatty tissue. In the body of the stomach, we can find gastric glands. In the gastric glands, there are several cell types. So, these gastric glands are straight tubular glands. So, they synthesize and secrete gastric juice. And this gastric pit occupy part of the thickness of the gastric mucosa. And each has 1 to 7 gastric glands opening into it. So these are the gastric gland and this part is the gastric pit. So this mucosal part is protected from self-digestion by a thick surface of covering mucosa. Those mucosa is secreted by these surface mucus cells. And the surface mucus is maintained at a higher pH than the gastric juice, so that they can protect the mucosa from self-digestion. And the gastric juice secreted by these gastric glands are a watery secretion containing hydrochloric acid. So its pH is around 0.9 to 1.5. And it also has the digestive enzyme pepsin. So, in gastric glands, we can see several cell types. Those are the surface mucus cells, neck mucus cells, parietal or oxyntic cells, chief pepticocytogenic cells, neuroendocrine cells, and stem cells. When we talk about the pyloric stomach, it has branched and coil glands. So the gastric pits of these glands occupy half the thickness of the pyloric mucosa. So that is a differing point from uh, glands of the body of the stomach, because the gastric pits of the body of the stomach, gastric pits of the glands in the body of the stomach occupy only part of the thickness of the mucosa, and the pyloric glands, their gastric pits occupy about half the thickness of the pyloric mucosa. And these glands are lined almost exclusively by mucus secreting cells, which are similar to the neck mucus cells. So a small number of acid secreting cells seen scattered among the pyloric glands. And the stem cells are found in the neck of the glands. So in this picture, you can clearly see the difference of this stomach cardiac area and stomach pyloric area, pylorus area structure. So they are in the pyloric area, you can see neuroendocrine cells also. So they are also scattered among the pyloric mucus cells. These neuroendocrine cells are the ones who secrete the peptide hormone called gastrin. So that is why those cells are called as G cells. And this picture shows the area of pyloric sphincter. So it is a place which shows a very abrupt transition from glandular secretory type mucosa of the stomach to villous absorptive type mucosa of the duodenum here, and the remaining of the small intestine. So the pyloric sphincter area consists of very high, markedly thickened circular layer of muscularis propria at the gastroduodenal junction. But the inner oblique layer of the muscularis propria is found only in the body of the stomach. It's not found in the pylorus or the other areas. So then let's talk about the functions of the stomach. The main function is to store and retention of food. So in adult, it has a capacity of about 1500 ml and may be retained for 2 or more hours of time. So also it has the function of mixing of the food with gastric secretions. And after that, it forms a semi-fluid chyme of food. And it can absorb water, alcohol, and some drugs. And it delivers the chyme to the small intestine, so more specifically to the duodenum. And it also controls the rate of delivery of the chyme to the small intestine. Then it has this specific secretory function. It secretes acid pepsin gastric juices, protective mucus, hormones such as serotonin, gastrin, and somatostatin, and intrinsic factor. So what is intrinsic factor? It is the factor which we need to absorb vitamin B12. And it prevents regurgitation of gastric contents back into the esophagus by the action of cardiac sphincter. So the basis of structure-function relationship, the food undergoes chemical and mechanical breakdown to form the chyme. So for that, the solid foods we ingest are further broken down by the strong muscular action of the stomach, while chemical background is produced by the gastric juices secreted by the stomach mucosal glands. So the once chyme is formed and its formation is completed, the pyloric sphincter relaxes and allows the liquid chyme to be squirted into the duodenum. And the rate of releasing the liquid chyme to the duodenum is also controlled by the pyloric sphincter. For the secretory function, the gastric glands has many differentiated cells, and to prevent the backflow of the food from the stomach to the esophagus, there are suggested mechanisms of the cardiac sphincter. So you can see here there are some mucosal folds at the esophagogastric junction. So these folds act as a valve, and you can see there is a acute angle at the entry of the esophagus into the stomach. So it also produces a distinct valve-like effect. And though there is no a proper anatomical sphincter at the lower esophagus, the circular muscle layer of the lower esophagus is acting as a physiological sphincter, and the arrangement of the muscle fibers around the stomach cardia also act as a sphincter at the cardiac orifice. And the diaphragm, right crust of the diaphragm also curves around the cardia of the stomach like a sling, and it acts as a pinch cock to the lower esophagus and pierces this muscle. So the positive intra-abdominal pressure also compress the walls of the short segment of the intra-abdominal part of the esophagus, and it also acts as a physiological sphincter. At last, as a summary, to remember again what we have learned today, so we have discussed about both the esophagus and stomach. Something about its gross anatomy, blood supply, nerve supply, and the lymph drainage, and some introduction for the microscopy and the function and the structure function relationship. Thank you. So you can have your references with Snell's clinical anatomy, Peter's histology, and Harold Ellis clinical anatomy.